Liz Truss will be the next Prime Minister. She's promised
that we will deliver, we will deliver, and we will deliver.
But has so far been fairly silent on the actual policy commitments that matter so much to people. So what can we really expect from our new PM? And will she be all that different from Boris Johnson? Freddie, you were there in the hall where it was announced. What was your response to it and what was the atmosphere like?
Well, I think we already knew what the result was going to be. I think it wasn't as an emphatic win as some expected. So there was a recognition of that within the hall. I think the big story is going to come in the next few days when we see Liz Truss's announcements. There wasn't actually that much policy contained within her speech, and I thought she was still in campaign mode. She was still speaking to the party faithful. There wasn't an attempt, for instance, to unify the party and to speak to the public and trying to communicate what she's going to do. So I think that was quite interesting. I think she missed a trick there, and I can imagine quite a few Tory MPs won't be as satisfied with what she said as they could have been.
Yeah, it was interesting. There was a line in it. I was watching it on TV, so I was sort of getting it through that kind of lens. And her speech sounded a bit muted, and the response to it sounded a little bit awkward. There was sort of a laughter line that she left after she said that Boris Johnson was loved from, was it Carlisle to Kiev?
Yeah, Kiev to Carlisle. Yeah, there was so many pauses throughout the speech. It was very awkward. It was, there was another line, I will deliver for our NHS. And there was sort of a wait. People were expecting her to say in what way. She was waited. There was very awkward applause, and she went on. So that was sort of the theme of the speech.
Right. Okay. And Rachel, you were in the Commons while all of this was happening. What was the reaction from people you were bumping into there?
I think what surprised me today is how this has felt like so much of a non-event. Yeah. It feels like a changing over of like a Lord Mayoralty rather than like a new Prime Minister. And that's sort of like not to say anything about the office of Prime Minister. I think it's just, we're just that used to it now. We've had sort of David Cameron, we're all in this together, big reaction to the Blair years, trying to switch to austerity. Then we've gone to Theresa May, who was like the first Brexit PM. She was going to be the compromise, bring Remain and Leave together. And she got turfed out. And then we moved to Boris Johnson, who was supposed to be, the completion of this realignment of the country where he sort of smashed the red wall and it was supposed to be a whole big new thing. And this is a party that kind of prides itself on reinventing itself all the time. And I just kind of wonder, there was no buzz at all in Portcullis House today. It was kind of like, oh, here we go then.
Right. Yeah,
and that was kind of remarkable in itself, really.
Yeah, that's a reflection in part of the problems that Liz Truss faces, but also I think there's a creeping worry that she doesn't actually have the solutions to these problems. We've not yet had the detail. She, as I mentioned, she had a singular clause on the NHS. That was all that was in the speech. We had a few words on energy, but there was no substantive policy or anything like that. So the problems that she faces aren't matched by the solutions that she's setting out.
Yeah, and we'll talk more in detail about the energy policy in the second half of the podcast. But it is interesting that one of her first challenges might be that lack of enthusiasm. So we've spoken about how few Conservative MPs actually backed her. She wasn't the MP's favourite. And now you look at the result from the membership and, she wasn't sort of streets ahead of Sunak as some of the polling, some of the sort of maybe wilder polling suggested. And that's something that we've spoken about on the podcast before as well, how what we were hearing from the members when we were talking to people in the country wasn't really matching up with some of the sort of commentary around this race. And so that may be something that affects sort of her confidence, but also the support that she has from the party faithful.
Yeah, I thought it was, when you sort of look at the results, Truss Sunak 57.4% to 42.6%, but then sort of Johnson's victory over Hunt was so much bigger, 66-33 roughly. David Cameron, David Davies, 67.6% versus 32.4%. And IDS, Ken Clarke was kind of, 60-40. So she's got the worst result in the last 20 years when it comes down to the membership, the grassroots. And when you think back to the sort of the beginning of the campaign, there weren't that many MPs in the first instance who supported it. She got more on side when it became very, very clear she was going to be the victor. Yeah. And they kind of thought, I might
Which shows the way that polling can impact the way that a campaign plays out as well. And I'm so glad that we've got Ben here as well, who can maybe explain a little bit more about sort of whether or not the polls were so off the mark and sort of how this matches up with contests past.
They were off quite a bit. If you look at all the polls, the average was you had almost a miss of close to 9 percentage points, 8 percentage points. Opinion, closest, they got it off by 4 percentage points. It wasn't great. Opinion being off by 4 isn't terrible. Let's just remember, polling is a science. It's a science. It's not pinpoint accuracy. It is a range. You know, you get a number, and you always have to bear in mind it's probably around that number anyway. And in polling generally, it's 3 to 4 points out. This, though, it wasn't terrible. It wasn't great, but it wasn't abysmal. It was poor, to be honest with you. You had them missing out by around about 8 or so percentage points. And you know what? That is the same figure. The number out was the same in 2019. So YouGov in 2019 overestimated the share of members who were going Boris Johnson by 9 points. They had Johnson on, I think, 74% when he got 65% of the member vote. And if you applied that error, if you applied that 9-point error to the current polls, you would have found the polls showing a much tighter race. And to be honest, the current polls got it wrong by as much as last time. That's quite curious. Now, would that have changed the narrative? Would we have been talking about the campaign in a different way? Well, Liz Truss was still a favourite. She was definitely the favourite. She would have definitely got more than she got more. What did she get? She got 57%. And I don't know how much of the narrative would have changed. Rishi Sunak would have actually been in there. He would have been competitive. And I think really this is the problem with the way we cover polling. We need to stop looking at polling as, if a poll says Truss is on 60%, don't think Truss is on 60%, and if the result is 59%, the poll got it wrong. Look at 60% and think, okay, historically, how badly do pollsters do? Previously, they got it out by 9 points. And then you add in also the historic error, margin of error. You've got to always bear that in mind. It's give an example, 2016 EU referendum, all the polls pointing to Remain win, didn't they? Yeah, and everyone, all the academics, all the commentators thought, Remain was walking away with it. No. The final poll was like 51-49 to Remain. If you add in margin of error, that's neck and neck. It's the way, absolutely covering polling is key, but it's the way we cover it. It's the level of nuance we give. It's the attention to the error we give. That means we cover it better. And I don't think we did that well in this campaign.
I could kind of guess a little bit of the polling situation just from like how hard the front runner has been briefing. How hard her team have been saying, he's got absolutely no chance. Rishi Sunak, absolutely no chance. He's finished. And then sort of in the run up to this result this week, it's going to be a landslide. It's going to be so huge. Because they want people to report that 57.4% is this massive result and that she's got complete authority and none of her MPs should ever think about rebelling or questioning her in any way. They kind of try to manage their party and manage expectations through people who are reporting the results. So I kind of think I base my predictions on just how intense people briefing me are.
Of desperation. Yeah, I think I won't miss all of the Liz for Leader and what's Rishi's equivalent? Ready for Rishi press releases in my inbox. There was a lot of policy announced weirdly during the campaign, but like you said, Freddie, we still don't know sort of what the answers are on those key areas. If you're finding our analysis useful, please hit the like button below or leave us a comment. Thank you. And now it's time for a section we like to call
You Ask Us.
You Ask Us.
Ben's forgiven because he is on a delay.
There we go, thank
you. So the question we have today is, what is Liz Truss's plan for energy bills? So this is the big question. And actually, we still don't know the answer. Rachel, what do we know so far? There's been a bit of briefing.
Yeah, from the interview that Liz Truss did in the FT some weeks ago saying there'll be no handouts, that does not seem to be what's going to happen at the minute. I think there's a slow acceptance of the reality that people will not be able to cope with the huge rises in bills we're about to see. But it sounds like her plan could be like something in the region of 100 billion. It could be absolutely huge, but how she kind of does it is not yet clear. We've seen some people being interviewed this morning. I think Alex Shelbrooke's one of her first supporters, kind of, when he was asked about, something close to the Labour plan of a windfall tax, he kind of didn't run a million miles away from it. But it sounds more likely that it's going to be a bailout for energy companies. And that might mean more borrowing, basically, to try and cope with it. But there will be a plan, and we're expected to get it sort of within the next week via what is not an emergency budget, it's a fiscal event.
Freddie, what are you hearing?
Well, I think it is going to be bigger, as Rachel said, but we need to recognise that the tax cuts that she's already promised will happen. They are going to occur, whatever. So the additional support for people is going to come on top of them. Hence, the numbers are so vast. So I think that's important to recognise.
And some of the big lines over the weekend were that she was scrutinised over this tax cut that she's going to bring in, and how it's regressive because it means that the sort of rich are helped more than the poor, mainly because they pay more tax because their salaries are higher. And she was saying it is fair and that we shouldn't be hung up so much on that redistribution question. Does that suggest that she's going to take politics in a different direction? Or
I kind of saw it as that, yeah, because it felt like a proper reversion to like Margaret Thatcher trickle down economics, like we don't necessarily oppose giving a bit more money to the more well off, and that kind of just trickling down and ultimately benefiting people at the bottom. Whereas in the last sort of 10 or 20 years, there's been more of a progressive approach to politics where you'd kind of want to mitigate and make sure that those who are a little bit poorer would benefit a little bit more. But it just seemed like she was very hard line on that and said, yes, that is fair. That is what her kind of fallback was that she said it was specifically what they'd promised in the Conservative Party manifesto. But her attitude towards it, her lack of willingness to explain or to sort of suggest that she was prepared to take a different direction was kind of striking.
Yeah, because it wasn't that they promised tax cuts as such in the Conservative manifesto. It's just that she wants to go back to what they did say, which they said they wouldn't increase national insurance. So I think she's trying to frame it slightly different than it actually was. And I think you also saw a massive retrenchment back to her right-wing economic beliefs in the speech today. There was no mention about levelling up, for instance. There was no mention, apart from the brief sentence on the NHS, there wasn't a mention of public services. But instead we got a message that really in 2019 people voted for tax cuts. That's what she said. That's what she said the Conservatives should continue to deliver because that's what they were elected to do. Now, I think, as we've discussed many a time on this podcast, I don't think that's correct, but it shows that she's going to stick with her guns on this, I think. She is going to have to, at some point, pivot to the public and address them, and we'll probably see that in the speech at Downing Street tomorrow. But you've still got a complete commitment to tax cuts, which I think will be a key thread throughout her premiership.
I have to say that all of this stuff, when you read it, is incredibly jarring. Some of my colleagues and I have been speaking to people around the country about this new protest for not refusing to pay your energy bills, basically. And there's going to be a lot of people who can't pay their energy bills, let alone refusing to pay it out of protest. And all of this stuff feels very out of touch with what people are talking about. The only thing people were saying to us, and this was a whole range of people, corner shop owners, supermarket workers, all the way up to, tech industry professionals, music industry people. Everyone that we interviewed were just saying the same thing, which was we need help with our energy bills and it's going to be a disaster. And they couldn't believe that there wasn't a plan already. And actually, Ben, this is coming through in some of the polling that you've been writing about recently. How strong is that strength of feeling? And also, we see a lot of stats about sort of Conservative voters even being in favour of renationalising energy now.
Oh, yeah. There's always majority plurality support for taking public services back taking industry, taking whatever back into public ownership. There's always majority support for that. And that isn't often a line wheeled out by those on the Labour left, which says, well, we've got the people around us, so why not let us lead? Why not let us lead and push that message? Well, the key thing is competence. People, you need to be seen as competent. You need to be seen as capable of doing it in such a way so as not to be seen as incapable or a drain on resources or drain on tax or whatever. Don't pay campaign. This campaign, as you say, which is encouraging us to sort of strike and boycott the energy price rise. It's curious the level. The level of sympathy for it is quite curious. You have around about 40% of Britons who say yes, I understand that, and I'd support that, and then you have around about 38% who say no, I wouldn't support this boycott of higher fuel bills. And the age differentials is staggering, really. You have an overwhelming majority of those 18 to 24, 25 to 34 who say, completely support this, and then it's the older generations, those coincidentally who have higher levels of disposable income, who do not agree in not paying your bills. But no, as you say, the cost of living is king at present, and anything Truss the attention Truss gives, if she tries to pivot back to Rwanda or immigration or any other issue, is a complete distraction from where the priorities of the public are at the moment. And it's been like that for over a year. I've said this on podcasts, I've said this on the Twitter Spaces, and the thing I keep saying is like we are so used to whinging about our bills. We do it all the time. My parents do it all the time. They always say, "Oh, I wish we could win some money." We've been doing that in good times and bad, but the reality is. And so that allows us to sort of forget that it's actually an issue. That sort of allowed us to forget that, actually people are struggling. When the reality is the level of attention to the cost of living, to inflation, to prices, to the economy, to jobs is as high as it was during the financial crisis today. You can look at the Ipsos Issues Index and find as much. The level of attention is just staggering. And so the government to think they can drill in on Rwanda to distract voters for an election campaign, for the government to think they can make some noise about trans people, boo, hiss, it really is just a total disconnect. It's bubble think. These Conservative parliamentarians who say they were anti-bubble, against the bubble, who wanted to break apart the Westminster bubble, they've created their own bubble by going on anything other than the cost of living, haven't they?
Well, I think it's really interesting what you say about how, we all moan about how much our bills are. This idea of it being something that resonates with everyone is coming through from people we've been speaking to in the Don't Pay campaign, but also Enough is Enough, which is another sort of cost of living campaign with some support from figures within the Labour Party and the unions as well. That's gaining momentum now. There's been quite a few big rallies, and what they're telling us is that they're quite surprised at, how much engagement they're getting compared to other campaigns that they may have sort of tried to pull together in the past. I think one quote from someone was, it's not just the same old crusty activists. So it's, anyone is stopping them, if they're giving out flyers or something or coming along to any events in the street, because they understand it is touching pretty much everyone, which may be a sort of defense of Liz Truss's thing about, universal help or universal tax cuts rather in her worldview. This isn't something that politicians can escape. Maybe in the early years of austerity, it did only affect people who didn't have a big enough voice to make that much of a difference on policy or in elections. But this feels different. That's what I'm being told by people that I've been speaking to who are trying to campaign on this issue.
Well, I think it's early stages of the campaign, and it's kind of coming up as an issue now, isn't it? And I think Liz Truss, I guess, if I was sort of PM sitting down thinking about it between now and sort of next summer, and I could bail out people to get through until then, I'd kind of think or hope that campaign may lose a little bit of steam, or that they can get people over the worst of it and then reconcile people with whatever comes next. So, yeah, be interesting to see what her bailout exactly does look like, and to what stage she will get people through to, because, as a lot of people pointed out to Keir Starmer when he put his windfall tax plan through, it's kind of, that's going to get you through until the next time they want to put bills up, because the war in Ukraine doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon.
What do you think? Will Liz Truss be a better leader than Boris Johnson and deliver for the UK? Or are we watching the demise of the Tory party at the expense of the country? Let us know what you think in the comments. I recently spoke to people who are refusing to pay their energy bills or simply can't pay. You can watch that video here. And you can access all of our commentary and analysis by subscribing to the New Statesman from just £1 a week. The link's in the description.